Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Sperry Symposium. Today we're going to be pleased to hear from David Lefevre. David Lefevre has taught Seminary Institute and BYU adult education classes, though as a volunteer, not a church employee, starting in 1979. He has taught at Education Week in Provo for several years and in Rexburg. He has published many articles on history, the scriptures, and technology. This is his second Sperry Symposium. He is currently employed by Microsoft in Richmond, Washington, is married to the former Melanie Carrier, and they are the parents of 7 and grandparents of 4, soon to be 5. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming. So this is like some of those things where they film somebody and then they don't ever show the audience because they don't want anybody to know that there was nobody there, right? But thank you for coming. I know there are a lot of other choices today and a lot of other things to do on a Saturday, so appreciate you being here. I would like to talk today about the JST changes in the Psalms. The title of this, Give Me Right Word, comes from one of the Psalms that we'll talk about a little bit later. But the changes in the Psalms are very autobiographical for Joseph Smith. Right? So we'll talk more about that in a second. Let me talk about the date of how this happened first. The way the translation happened, because it helps to put the context in. If you want to understand the relevance of some of the changes that Joseph Smith made in the Psalms, you need to understand when he did that. All right, it's helpful. So when Joseph Smith first started the work on the JST, it was in June of 1830, and he started with the Old Testament, what we call today Moses chapter 1, and then Genesis chapter 1. It starts with Moses 1. Moses 1 is really the revelation that tells Joseph Smith to get going on the translation. Because when he has that, it's not in the Bible, but after he has that, then he starts in Genesis chapter 1. Anyway, June of 1830. And then in March of 1831, so just a little less than a year later, they stopped working on the Old Testament and they switched to the New. That's because of section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord says, go to work on the New. So they said, okay, we'll do that. And then they stopped working on it. It trickled a little bit into April, so that's why it's March, April, but that's fundamentally when they did it. In July of 1832, they finished the work on the New Testament, and there were some revisions subsequently, but basically then they turned back to the Old Testament. So that's why it's the key date. July of 1832, they start the work on the Old Testament again. They pick up in Genesis where they left off. And then Joseph Smith takes a little break, serves a couple of months where he's gone, doing a mission, so he's not there working on the translation. And then when he comes back, there's a Revelation, section 90, in the 8th of March, 1833, where the Lord refers to the work of the translation of the prophets. So that means that by March, they're in Isaiah or Jeremiah or something. Putting all that together, you can see that the work on the JST Psalms probably took place in January and February of 1833. That seems like the most likely place for that to have happened. So if you have your Doctrine and Covenants chronology, you don't have to open it right now, but at some point you can open that up in that chronology and look and see what revelations were prior to January of 1833 and then what happened afterwards. The ones that were prior are the ones that are interesting because that's relevant to the Psalms and how that work happened. So as Joseph Smith worked on the Psalms, more than any other translation work that he did in the Bible, they became very autobiographical. They became very personal to him. He was like Nephi. He was likening the Psalms to himself. And as he did that, it kind of falls into these 6 categories. And so that's what I've talked about, each one of these. First, there's eschatology. That's not a word we use a lot. It just means last days. Just think about last days. Right? So there's a lot of focus on the last days. Is encouragement against enemies and a hope against the powers of darkness. Those sound similar, but they're different. The enemies are mortal, the powers of darkness are not. And so both of those come out. It's reflective of his own revelations and visions. And there's this desire on Joseph Smith's part to hear and speak the word of the Lord that comes out very strongly in these Psalms. And then the last one is his desire for Zion, which was a really important theme during this entire period that he was working. All right, so we'll look at each of those. In terms of the eschatology, this is the first example. Psalm 10 was the first psalm that he changed. If you look at the manuscripts, he actually had the scribe write Psalms 1 through 9, no changes. And so the Psalm 10 is the first one he actually considered. And this verse is reflective of that. If you see it in the King James Version, it's in the past tense. Or at least it's in the present tense, one or the other. It's never in the future tense. The Psalms are not very prophetic, typically. They don't write about things in the future. But as Joseph Smith translated them, he changed many of them to future tense, like you can see here. And the Lord shall be king forever and ever over his people, for the wicked shall perish. All right, so this verse is an example of that. And that change in tense and the change in the topic puts them in a future connotation and puts them in our day, makes them very relevant to us. Because the original writer of the Psalms wrote in his tense, Joseph Smith brought it into our day by putting him in future tense in that context. And I've thrown some pictures of the manuscripts up here if that's useful, interesting. I thought they're kind of fun to see. One of the nice things now is thanks to the work of Kent Jackson, if you were at the keynote today, and some others, Scott Follering and Bob, can't believe I'm forgetting his name. Matthews, thank you. Bob Matthews. They worked really, really well with the organized church to get the manuscripts published now. And so you can, for less than $20, buy a DVD that has pictures of every page of the Joseph Smith translation manuscripts. It's really a deal. So I pulled some of those pictures from that. But anyway, that's the key thing here is this whole future tense and putting it into our day. Here's some other examples that I think are kind of fun. The heathen shall be enraged. Look at all the future tense that's in this one. And their kingdom shall be moved, and the Lord shall utter his voice, and the earth shall be melted. See, every one of those gets changed. In the King James Version, it's all past tense. The Lord did all these things. And in the King James Version, it really refers almost to the time of Moses. Right? It's talking about the great works that God did in the Exodus and other things. The Lord of hosts who shall be with us, God of Jacob is our refuge. And then the last one, he shall make in the earth in the latter days. So that addition also puts in the context. In case we miss the sense that the future, is our day, then it calls it out very specifically that it's in the latter days. Another example here. And some of these, as I say, we're going to pull in some scriptures from the Doctrine and Covenants that are relevant to this. This one's kind of fun. And saith to the nations, if you read the previous verses, the Lord speaking, right? So the Lord saith to the nations, be still and know that I am God. And then the last one, the Lord of hosts shall be with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Be still and know that I am God. This turns this psalm into a prophecy that the Lord will say this to the nations. Be still and know that I am God. Well, that actually happened in Doctrine and Covenants section 101, shortly after this psalm was given. In fact, it's December of 1833, so just about 10 months later. The Lord says in that psalm, which is that Doctrine and Covenants section rather, it's an announcement to the entire world, be still and know that I am God. So that prophecy of the psalm that he was added in the Joseph Smith translation was fulfilled 10 months later in the JST. All right. Here's another example of this eschatology focused on the last days. This one has some interesting ties as well. So in that day thou shalt come, O Lord, and I will put my trust in thee. Thou shalt say unto thy people, for thy ear hath heard thy voice. Thou shalt say unto every soul, flee unto my mountain, and the righteous shall flee like a bird that is let go from the snare of a fowler. Now, I didn't explain this at the beginning. All the stuff in bold is what's added. Right, so the base text is just regular text. That's the King James text. On the left is the King James text with the words that were deleted, anything that was deleted. On the right, everything that was added through the translation process. So you can see this was changed dramatically. This verse was changed dramatically. And includes this reference here to the snare of the fowler. There are 3 other references in the Old Testament that use that phrase already. This adds a 4th one. And in each case here, these are kind of referring to someone being trapped by something. Right? So there's but none of them talk about escape. This one here, these are references in the New Testament where that phrase is used by Paul, and he's using it in the context of how the saints need to escape Satan like a bird from a fowler. Right? So Paul uses that to explain it. I thought I had a scripture there. So those those Old Testament references and this new one, this is the only one of those 4 references, though, that really where they tell the story of the righteous need to flee to the mountain in order to escape the snare of the fowler. Well, what's the mountain in the Old Testament? The temple, right? We know that from Isaiah and from other scriptures. The mountain is the temple. And so this is a fascinating one because remember, this was 1833, early 1833. The Lord had not yet commanded them to build a temple in Kirtland. So that hadn't happened yet. But here, this psalm sets them up for that kind of thinking because it says, flee to the Lord's mountain to escape the snares of the devil. And then it's shortly after this that the Lord finally gives the command that says, build the temple. All right. Lord strong and mighty. I should have somebody else read this so I don't have to turn around. Lord strong and mighty, Lord mighty in battle, who is the King of glory, shall establish you forever. You like that phrase, the King of glory? That shows up a lot, again, here in the Psalms. Joseph Smith has that added by inspiration. He will roll away the heavens and will come down to redeem his people, to make you an everlasting name, to establish you on a rock. Lift up your head, O ye generation of Jacob. Lift up your heads, ye everlasting generations. And the Lord of hosts shall come unto you and shall redeem his people and shall establish them in righteousness. So all future tense, all very last days oriented. It's when God's going to have the final triumph. A couple of things that are interesting here. When he makes these changes, the Psalms, as you know, like Isaiah, are written in poetry. And Hebrew poetry is parallelism. So it says one phrase and then it says another. And they might say the same thing, they might say different things. There's different kinds of parallelism. But that parallelism is what makes the poetry, what gives it structure. This JST change improves the parallelism. Now, Joseph Smith didn't know anything about that. So I always find that interesting. This happens actually multiple times in the Psalms, where he makes a change that improves the parallelism, makes the message even stronger and correlate better than it is in the original, makes the poetry better. So he's writing great Hebrew poetry, what it comes down to. But up here, this one's interesting. He will roll away the heavens and come down to redeem his people. That phrase shows up in these other references here. Think about the chronology. Joseph Smith had already translated Revelation. So the one in Revelation, of course, here, I got him right here. The one in Revelation, the middle one, says the heavens depart as a scroll when it is rolled together. So it has to do with the last days and God's second coming. And when Christ comes for the second time, how the heavens will be rolled away so everyone can see. He'd already translated that phrase. Doctrine and Covenants section 88 was just before this, so he'd already received that revelation. Silence in the heaven for half an hour, and the curtain of heaven shall be unfolded as a scroll is unfolded before it is rolled up. So he had those two references. When he adds this new one in the Psalms, though, it has a little different flavor because it has to do with the heavens rolling away and to allow Christ to come, right, and redeem his people. And then we get this one later in the chronology. He translates Isaiah after he does Psalms, and he adds this in Isaiah, right? The heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. So these things all kind of come together in a very interesting way as Joseph Smith begins to understand that phrase in the Psalms. But it all relates to the last days and the second coming of the Lord. And then here's the last one. Therefore, thus saith the Lord. Look at how much is added here. Thus saith the Lord, by the way, this is the only time in the Psalms that phrase shows up. It's not in the Psalms in the King James Version at all. But Joseph Smith was very familiar with that phrase from the Doctrine and Covenants. Lots of the scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants start, thus saith the Lord. So for him to put that in the Psalms turns this psalm into a prophecy in a way that he absolutely understood. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, I will arise in that day. I will stand upon the earth, and I will judge the earth. Why? Because they oppress the poor and the needy. And their cry, the poor and the needy, hath entered into my ear. Therefore, the Lord shall sit in judgment upon those who say in their hearts, we all sit in safety. Right. And then continuing that same psalm, these are the words of the Lord, yea, pure word like silver. So confirming that that prophecy comes from the Lord himself. And thou shalt save thy people, O Lord, shalt keep them and preserve them from the wickedness of this generation. So these are all promises the Lord gave to Joseph Smith. Now, again, think of yourself as this young prophet in 1833 with a small church and a struggling group of members. Some of them had just went to Missouri to try to establish Zion. Most of them are in Kirtland. They're trying to figure out what's going on. They don't really have a lot of things yet. There's the organization of the church is very infantile. The number of members are very small. And yet he's having these prophecies, having these experiences where through the Psalms, the Lord is revealing to him that he's going to take care of his righteous people. He's going to preserve them. He's going to take care of them through all the trials of the last days. So I think that's why this is an example of how this is speaking to Joseph Smith in a very revelatory and personal way. Okay, we do have a small group, so feel free to ask questions if you want. Yeah.
In our King James Version, do we have as footnotes in the Psalms what we've got here?
Great.
So we just can read the Psalm and look at footnotes?
So how do we find these changes in the Psalms? I'm repeating the question for the camera. Some of them are in the footnotes. Some of them are in the appendix. You know, there's an appendix right before the maps that has some longer changes. Most of them are not. So these particular changes kind of didn't make the cut, many of them. Some of them do, like Psalm 14 and some of the other. Many of them don't make the cut. So if you want to see them all, you have to get the manuscripts or like Tom Wayman's publication that has the changes of the Joseph Smith translation, those kinds of things, yeah. Only about 1/3 of all the changes in the Joseph Smith translation end up in the footnotes of our Bible. So 2/3 of them just couldn't, you know, if we put them all in there, you'd have a second Bible. So they don't all make the cut. But the good ones do, frankly. They were very good at choosing the right ones.
Bible that Joseph Smith translated, that is with the community of Christ.
Yes.
Would that have these changes?
No, he didn't write in his Bible. So the question is, you know, what's in the Bible that Joseph Smith used when he was doing the translation? He didn't write in that Bible. He made little check marks and other notes to indicate where verses should be changed, but all the changes are in the manuscripts. Right?
So, going back to the concept of, you said he was writing poetry.
Yes.
Parallelism, he improved it.
He improved it.
He wasn't really writing new stuff. He was trying to restore the meaning of the original author of it, right?
So the question is, were these changes to the Psalms a restoration? Some of them were, some of them are new. The JST has many purposes, and a lot of the stuff in the JST is in fact a restoration of ancient text as the way it was, but other changes in the JST are brand new material. You know, Moses chapter 1, for example, don't know if that was ever written down. That could just be a revelation that he received, kind of like Doctrine and Covenants section 7.
So, in this situation, he was both role as translator and prophet, revealing
Yes.
new wording that the Lord would want.
Yeah, that's correct. He was translator and prophet in the Psalms. Okay. All right. Oops, I went too fast. Let's look at the next section. There we go. Encouragement against his enemies. Now this is where, if you remember, the history, in 1832, Joseph Smith was living at the Johnson farm in Hiram, Ohio, and he had some people break into his house at night. And they dragged him out and tarred and feathered him and broke his tooth and did a bunch of other stuff. Sidney Rigdon was dragged across his head and permanently injured as a result of that. All right. Joseph Smith faced other kinds of persecution. By the way, the chief instigators of that group that dragged Joseph out of his house and tarred and feathered him were disenchanted Mormons. Simon's writer, Ezra Booth. Right, these were people who got upset with Joseph Smith over something. Simon's writer, because Joseph spelled his name wrong. Literally. He left the church over his name. Simon's. He spells it weird anyway. So, as Joseph Smith had all these persecutions in Colesville, you know, people coming out to stop baptisms and other things, he was very sensitive to this. And this starts in 1820. When he shares his first vision with a Methodist minister, his experience, who was a trusted friend and an authority figure in his life. And when he shared that first vision experience, the Methodist minister said, never speak of this again. What you're saying is blasphemy. You know, he told Joseph those kinds of things. That had to be devastating to a 14-year-old. So he's very sensitive to the kind of persecutions and other things that he's faced throughout his life. And many of the changes speak to that to encourage Joseph Smith against these mortal enemies that he has now, and frankly, it's only going to get worse. He doesn't know that in 1833, but it's only going to get worse. The wicked condemn, that should say condemn, that's not a typo, that's what it says in the King James Version, but that's what it means. The wicked condemn God, wherefore he doth say in his heart, thou wilt not require iniquity in my hand. So the wicked says, basically, I can get away with this. Right? That's what the wicked man says. And then the plea, by adding the words, O Lord, it turns it into a prayer. The plea is, O Lord, thou hast seen all this. You've seen all this stuff I'm going through, all that I'm suffering. For thou beholdest mischief and spite to requite with thy hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee, and thou art the helper of the fatherless. So the poor for Joseph Smith very much becomes a metaphor for the church, both figuratively and literally. Most of the people that joined the church in that day were the poor. And so as he reads about in the Psalms how the Lord's going to take care of the poor and turn things around for them and protect them against their enemies, that was a very real reassurance to him. O Lord, thou wilt break the arm of the wicked and of his evil, and seek out his wickedness until thou find none that remain. And the Lord shall be king forever over his people. So this is also eschatological, right? They get mixed up a little bit. For the wicked shall perish out of his hand. But again, the plea is, Lord, please do this. Please take care of my enemies and push them away. And then this one, the wicked walk on every side, and the vilest men are exalted, but in the day of their pride thou shalt visit them. So these are assurances that the Lord is giving to his prophet. Let me just do one thing here. Sorry. Okay. That's the problem with a touch screen, right? Okay, sorry about that. So, all right, there we go. Now, that wasn't working, so that's why I want to do that. The word visit there, the Lord shall visit them, right? This is an addition to that. In Hebrew, that's typically this word here, pakad. And pakad has two senses. It's both a negative and a positive. It could mean, it means overseeing or supervision. So it could mean rewarding, because I'm overseeing somebody that's doing a good job, or it could mean punishing someone for not doing a good job. So it's not a negative or a positive inherently. And here's two scriptures that give you that sense of that. Joseph said, I die and God will surely visit you and bring you out. That's a good thing. But then in the Exodus, the Lord told them that I will visit their sin upon them. So that's not a good thing. All right, so which one is this one? Well, you can tell by the context that it's visiting upon the wicked, the punishment for their pride. So again, Joseph Smith is using these terms by inspiration that are found otherwise in the Old Testament. He's using them in very complex ways that really helps to say the message about that. All right. Now, this one here is hope against the forces of darkness. So we've dealt with mortal enemies, but now we're going to deal with satanic enemies, as it were. So there's a little bit different flavor to this one. Psalm 27. Unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, thou wouldest deliver my soul into hell. That's an interesting, there are some parallels, right? Deliver my soul into hell. You can see those verses there. I'll pull them up. Just let you take a look at those. That phrase is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, but it's unique in this psalm because you get delivered into hell if you don't believe in the goodness of God. So you have to believe in it. And that's the forces of darkness who don't believe in God, who just reject that he lives. Because thou didst say unto me, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he will strengthen thy heart. Again, forces of darkness, the Lord will perfect me in knowledge concerning his kingdom. And I will praise thee, O Lord, forever. Thou art merciful and will not forsake the works of thy hands. So again, here's the promise that the Lord will protect them against these forces. But one of the interesting things that comes out in this particular change, and this is late in the Psalms, by the way, one of the things that I found interesting is that most of the changes Joseph Smith made are in the early Psalms. 10, 11, 12, 14, 17, those. 138's way at the end. He kind of gets tired of them or something, I don't know, but about halfway through he quits making very many changes. But in 138 he made quite a few. And so he picks this one up. In the King James Version, this one ends up being much more of a plea for God's help. But in the Joseph Smith translation, it becomes a doxology. Right? It's a praise literature. It's where we're turning into, we're saying, praise God that he's going to take care of me against these powers of darkness that I'm facing. All right, and this one's fun. How many accounts do we know of about Joseph Smith's first vision that he wrote? All right, so there's lots of second party, right, and others, but he wrote 4 that we know of. Well, I'll contend that he now wrote 5. Because Psalm 14, as the Joseph Smith translation portrays it, is an account of the first vision. And it's fascinating, because it's not in the Psalms. I mean, it doesn't even look anything like that. But look what happens to it when he talks about this. Now again, just let me back up one sec. 1832 is the first time Joseph Smith wrote down an account of the first vision. This is January of 1833. 1832 is the first time he wrote that down. We don't know how many times he told the story before that. It seems like from the history, not very often, because most members of the church were unaware that Joseph Smith had had this vision in the Sacred Grove at 14 years old in that day. So he hadn't told this story to a lot of people. And the 1832 account is different than other accounts. If you've read them all, you know that the one that's in our scriptures, Joseph Smith's audience and his purpose was very much to talk about how he learned, that other churches weren't true and it was time to establish a new one. In the 1832 account, his focus is very much on his own situation. I feared for my salvation, so I went to the Lord to pray. Those kinds of things. But he has this conversation with the Lord still in 1832 about what's church to join and all of that, which church is true. So look at this one in the Psalm 14 in the JST changes. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no man that hath seen God, because he showeth himself not unto us, therefore there is no God. How many people in Joseph Smith's day told him there are no visions? You can't see God. And many of them who didn't believe said, there's no God in this world because he never shows himself. Look at all the evil in this world. I mean, I heard this on my mission. Look at all the evil in this world. Look at all the people that are doing terrible things. If there was a God, these things wouldn't happen. God is not revealing his hand to the world in any way. Right? That's an important change. So these people say that. This is what Joseph Smith was hearing as a 14-year-old. But behold, they are corrupt. They have done abominable works, and none of them doeth good, as he's looking around the world. Joseph Smith said later in his history, by the way, that Psalm 14 was one of the scriptures that influenced him to go into the Sacred Grove, along with James 1:5. We talk about James 1:5 because that's the one that's talked about in our scriptures, but in other accounts of the first vision, Psalm 14 was very important to him. For the Lord looked down upon heaven upon the children of men, and by his voice said unto his servant, now here's the first vision. God is speaking to Joseph Smith in the grove. So he says unto his servant, seek ye among the children of men. Look around to see if there's any that do understand God. One of the things that Joseph Smith said in his accounts of the first vision is, and many other things did the Lord say to me, which I do not record at this time. All right? This might be some of those things. Look around. Are there any that understand God? And he, the servant, opened his mouth and said unto the Lord, behold, all these who say they are thine. I keep going to all these churches and they tell me that they're true. All these say that they're thine. But the Lord answered and said, they are all gone aside. They have together become filthy. Thou canst behold none of them that are doing good, no, not one. And they have for their teachers workers of iniquity, and there is no knowledge in them. They are they who eat at my people. All right, so this is really, again, this is a fascinating thing, how I can imagine as Joseph Smith is sitting there translating the Bible and dictating this to his scribe, which was Frederick G. Williams at this time. And Frederick G. Williams is a counselor in the First Presidency. He's dictating this to his counselor, and they were probably having this conversation like, wow, Joseph, this is like your vision. This is the experience you had. I can just imagine that happening. This is very intimate. This is very personal. This is probably the most personal example in all the ones that we have in the Psalms. All right. Joseph Smith had this great desire to hear and speak the word of the Lord. When he was, in 1830, he published the Book of Mormon. He organized the church. He got everything the Lord had asked him to do done, and he went back to Harmony and started farming. And by all indications, Joseph Smith thought he was done. Right, there's nothing else to do. I did everything the Lord wanted me to do. I'm going to go back and take care of Emma and my family and just my farm and do all that. And in June of 1830, it's this work, it's this Joseph Smith translation that draws him back in and says, no, I still have more work for you to do, Joseph. And he ends up coming back to Fayette and getting going in the church. But he had these struggles all through this early period of his life. He gets much more confidence later. But in these early periods, he's going, I don't know how to do this. I'm such a young man. I don't have any experience. I'm buffeted by Ellis. So look these are from letters that he wrote in 1832 to different people, right? This is his own letters. I had an awful struggle with Satan. I am left to mourn and shed tears of sorrow for my folly. The bolded words are just to call them out. These aren't changes or anything, just so we're clear. Suffering the adversity of my soul to have so much power over me. Oftentimes wandered alone in the lonely places, seeking consolation of him who is alone able to console me. And I long to stand together and gaze upon eternal wisdom graven upon the heavens. Wilt thou deliver us in thy due time from the little narrow prison, almost as it were total darkness of paper, pen, and ink, and a crooked, broken, scattered, imperfect language. He says, the Lord's revealed this stuff to me, and I can't express it. I'm like in a prison with my words. Pen and paper is a prison to me because I can't get the things that the Lord's revealed to me out fast enough and in coherent words and language and everything. So this is how he felt. This is the struggle he felt at the time. Now look how these come out in the Psalms. O Lord, or how long, O Lord, wilt thou withdraw thyself from me? It says how long in this psalm 4 times. So there's this impatience here. How long wilt thou hide thy face from me that I may not see thee? Wilt thou forget me and cast me off from thy presence forever? Consider me, O Lord, and hear my cry, O my God, and lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the death of the ungodly. He really wanted to continue to have these divine manifestations like he'd had in the Sacred Grove. He longed for this. When they organized the School of the Prophets in 1832, again, weeks before this psalm was translated, the principal goal of the School of the Prophets was to let everyone there see the Lord, as Joseph Smith had seen. He not only longed this for himself, he longed for everyone around him to have the same experiences. Right? And so we see that here in the Psalms. And this, to me, this psalm in particular reminds me of Nephi's psalm in 2 Nephi chapter 4. A lot of similarity of languages that are kind of fun to play. I just pulled this one out from Nephi. Awake, my soul, no longer droop in sin. Rejoice, O my heart, give place no more to the enemy of my soul. This is where the title that I picked came from this one here. Give me right word, O Lord, and speak, and thy servant shall hear thee. I'm here. I'm just waiting to get your word so we can move forward. Attend unto my cry and give ear unto my prayer. I come not unto thee out of feigned lips. Thou hast proved my heart. You've looked into my heart. You know what's in my heart. Thou hast visited me in the night. Thou hast tried me. Thou shalt find nothing evil in me. So he says, I'm really trying hard to live your commandments. And I just want to get your word. I just need some direction and help and comfort here as I'm going through this. That first one, give me right word, that phrase is only in the Old Testament in one other location. Right there in Job 6:25. Put that up here. How forcible are right words. That word that's translated there is yosher from the Hebrew, meaning uprightness or honesty. I like that. So Joseph Smith was simply saying, give me honest words. Help me to say the truth. And then down here at the bottom, Thou shalt find nothing evil in me. You think about his history, and we won't read that whole phrase here, but you can see that Joseph Smith's history said, well, yes, I was guilty of some sins, but by and large, I was really trying to be a good person. I'm not guilty of these terrible sins, just little sins. So he's trying to live the words of the Lord. And then Psalm 22, we recognize as a psalm that Jesus spoke on the cross. The first part of this, right? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? In the JST, it gets changed. And listen to the plea that's in here. And think of, again, Joseph Smith going through these persecutions that he's suffering. Being drug out and tarred and feathered and all those things. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? My God, hear the words of my roaring. And by the way, see the improved parallelism there? This is another example where the poetry gets better in the JST. Thou art far from helping me. Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou answerest not. And in the night season, and I'm not silent. So this plea, for me, immediately brings to mind D&C 122. Now that's in the future, obviously. This is Liberty Jail. He hasn't had that yet. But when he gets to Liberty Jail, he uses a very similar phraseology as this. You know, my God, why hast thou forsaken us? Where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place? All those things. It's the same idea. And then this one, Joseph Smith, in his letters, has this longing to express things, to preach the gospel, but he also struggles with the challenges of doing that. And so this one reflects that. When I kept silence, my spirit failed within me. When I opened my mouth, my bones waxed old through my speaking. So I'm trying, right? I'm trying to speak. But when I don't talk, then it tires me out and my spirit fails. For day and night, my spirit was heavy upon me. My moisture is turned into the drought of summer. I can't help but tie this back to Jeremiah. And if you know the story, Jeremiah, the prophet, was preaching in Jerusalem, trying to get the people to do the right thing on the errand of the Lord. And they kept persecuting him. And they took him and they threw him in stocks in one particular thing. And they mocked him and they did all this. When they finally let him out of the stocks, he walks out of town in Jeremiah chapter 20 and he says, I'm done. I can't do this anymore, right? For since I spake, I cried out, cried violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord was made a reproach and a derision daily. I'm mocked. Every time I preach the Lord's word, all I get is mock. And then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak his word, nor speak any more in his name. I'm not going to do it. I'm done. But his word was in my heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones. And I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay. In other words, I tried to quit preaching, but the spirit that was in me was so strong that it drove me. I just had to go keep doing it. And that's how Joseph Smith felt. And you see that in this psalm. When I kept silence, my spirit fails. But when I preach, I still struggle with the persecutions. Oh, I didn't read Joseph Smith's quote, but you can see that there. I like that because he says, I like reading the scriptures better than preaching, but I'm called to preach, so I'll do it anyway, basically is what he's saying. I can relate to that. And then this one here, my soul thirsteth for to see God, for to see the living God. When shall I come and appear before thee, O God? My tears have been poured out unto thee day and night, while mine enemies continually say, where is your God, Joseph? Where is your God? Yeah. So the last one is the desire for Zion. The revelations about, where Zion was, what Zion was, start early in 1830 when he translates the early chapters of Genesis, which now are in our Pearl of Great Price as Moses, the early chapters of Moses. And he learns about Enoch and his city of Zion and all those things. And then there's just this flurry of revelation in 1831, 1832, where he's trying to understand this concept of Zion. It clearly touched him deeply as he learned about it in Moses, in Genesis. But now, so he asks the Lord and says, well, what is Zion? Zion is to take care of the poor, he learns. And Zion is to, come together. And Zion is a place. It's going to be a place, and I'll reveal it to you later. And finally, in section 42, Zion people live the law of consecration. And then the center place of Zion is independence. Right? So there's a string of revelations all focused on this topic right up to this time when he's doing the Psalms. So when he gets to the Psalms, he adds 4 references specifically to Zion in the Psalms that aren't there. And each of them are very kind of informative about what was in his mind. Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle, your your temple. Who shall dwell in thy holy hill of Zion? Not just in the temple, but in the temple at Zion. And again, another improvement of the parallelism in this one. Even in the Hebrew, holy hill and tabernacle are parallel, but adding holy hill of Zion strengthens the parallelism, makes it even more interesting, if I was even just a Jew. For Zion shall come, and God shall be in the midst of her. Zion shall come comes from Moses. That's the promise. Enoch received the Moses that one day Zion would return. Or Enoch received the promise from God that one day Zion would return to the earth, his Zion. So he says, when? When will Zion come? I don't know, but God will be in the midst of her when that happens in the Psalms. And oh, that Zion were come. Oh, I wish it was already here. It's so hard to do all the things that I have to do. The salvation of Israel, for out of Zion shall they be judged. Now, there's lots of references to judgment in the Old Testament. Lots of references. But this is the only one where God is judging from Zion, meaning he's coming to Zion, the place of the gathering of the saints and the place of the temple, and from there the judgment is issuing out. So that's an interesting doctrinal reference as well. And then the last one, now this is the tail end of Psalm 14. We've talked about Psalm 14 as the first vision. This is the second half of that psalm. So the first half is about the first vision. The second half is about Zion. They are in great fear, for God dwells in the generation of the righteousness. Again, prophetically speaking, because God will dwell in Zion. He is the counsel of the poor, because they are ashamed of the wicked and flee unto the Lord for their refuge. They are ashamed of the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is the refuge. Or that Zion were established out of heaven, the salvation of Israel. O Lord, when wilt thou establish Zion? This is the question that will haunt the saints for years. Joseph Smith wrote 2 letters, one about this time, right, January of 1833, where he said to N.C. Saxton, the city of Zion, spoken of by David in the 102nd Psalm, will be built upon the land of America, and ransomed Lord will return, and come and sing songs of everlasting joy, and they will be delivered from the overflowing scourge that will pass through the land. Right? He's very prophetic. It's going to happen right now, 1833. This is his mood. He doesn't know exactly when it's going to happen, but we're on the march. We're building Zion in Missouri. It's really happening. But look, in 1837, 4 years later, he writes another letter. This is after the saints have been driven from Missouri, and after they've suffered all the persecutions. And they're saying, why? What's happening here? Why can't we establish Zion? Why isn't the Lord helping us? He says this, therefore, brethren, he's writing to the saints now, it remains for all such to be exercised with prayer and continual supplication until Zion is redeemed. We realize the situation that all the brethren and sisters must be in, being deprived of their spiritual privileges, not only their lands, but being deprived of their spiritual privileges because they were driven out of Zion, which are enjoyed by those who set in heavenly places in Christ Jesus, where there are no mobs to rise up and bind their consciences. In other words, we don't know when Zion will be redeemed. It may not be in our lifetimes. We'll probably have to wait till we get to heaven to receive those rewards. What a change in 4 years. He had to learn this, and the Psalms begin to reflect that attitude because he's going, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? They were very anxious in 1833. They were still anxious in 1837, and frankly, we're still anxious today. When will Zion be established? Well, right now. We do that as we go. Well, this fly through the Psalms, I hope, was relatively useful. Joseph Smith, the Joseph Smith translation as a whole is a very intimate, revelatory, personal experience. It was Joseph Smith's training ground. This 3-year effort was how he learned to be a prophet. Because when he started, he was the humble farm boy that did what the Lord wanted but really had no clue. When he finished, he was a mighty prophet. There's a dramatic difference in these 3 years. And much of that was due to the Joseph Smith translation, the things that he learned and experienced as a result of that. And the Psalms are no exception. The Psalms were a powerful part of that experience. And I'm grateful for Joseph Smith, and I'm grateful for these words that we have that we can study and get an insight into him and how the Lord spoke to him and comforted him and directed him, but also how it can help us in our day as we prepare for all the same kinds of things, for persecutions, for Zion, for the last days and everything else that he was facing. And I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the Lord. I'm grateful for that, and leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you so much for coming.